Welcome to The Debate. Today we're diving into a really high-stakes maritime confrontation that unfolded recently in the North Atlantic. It all revolves around U.S. efforts to enforce some very complex economic sanctions, specifically targeting the Venezuelan-Iranian oil trade.
And this incident, it really represents far more than just sanctions enforcement. At its core was the U.S. pursuit of an older oil tanker, the Bella 1, which was later renamed the Marinera. But the crucial detail here is that the vessel was described as being basically empty and rusty, and yet it became the focus of this intense multinational surveillance effort.
Right. The pursuit was very real. You had U.S. Coast Guard assets moving deep in the Atlantic, and the clear operational intent was to seize the vessel. Not just its potential cargo, but the asset itself. And this is where the situation just fundamentally pivots. Russia responded to this planned seizure by deploying a military submarine, along with other naval assets, to directly escort the tanker.
And that deployment is the heart of the conflict, isn't it? It just instantly escalated what was a commercial, maybe a legal dispute, into a direct, high-risk military shadowing operation. So I think the central question we have to tackle is this. Should Russia's deployment of a submarine be seen primarily as a necessary justified defensive act against what they saw as illegal U.S. maritime coercion? Or was it an aggressive geopolitical maneuver designed to directly challenge U.S. dominance and its sanctions policy?
I'm going to argue that Russia's action was a necessary defense of its commercial interests against, well, what was clearly an aggressive and unilateral U.S. attempt at extraterritorial coercion. The U.S., I believe, was the party injecting military force into this situation.
And I'll be arguing that the deliberate choice to use a submarine, a strategic and, let's be honest, a highly secretive asset, was a clear and calculated aggressive escalation. It was specifically intended to raise the geopolitical stakes and undermine the entire Western pressure campaign.
Okay, so let's ground this in what happened right before. I see why you'd frame it as an escalation, but we really need to view this through the lens of prior U.S. behavior. The primary aggression was the sustained U.S. effort to enforce these sanctions unilaterally through overt military seizures. I mean, we know that just a month before this incident, U.S. Marines, Special Forces, and the Coast Guard carried out a very kinetic seizure of another tanker, the Skipper. That operation set a very clear, very aggressive precedent.
But that was against a vessel actively carrying sanctioned goods. That distinction matters here.
It does, but I think that distinction actually strengthens my argument. Even though the Bella 1 was empty, the extensive surveillance we saw pointed toward an imminent seizure, and that to me validated Russia's need for a strong countermeasure. I mean, just consider the assets that were deployed. You had U.S. surveillance planes, including the RC-135W rivet joint, that's a serious electronic intelligence platform, tracking the vessel, and you also had U.S. personnel practicing fast-roping maneuvers from V-22 Ospreys. Intelligence suggested transport planes with special ops helicopters were gathering at RAF Fairford.
That suggests a capacity to seize, yes, but not necessarily aggression in itself.
Oh, I disagree. When you assemble special operations capabilities like that at a forward base, that signals preparation for a kinetic takeover, a hostile military boarding. Russia's action then was a proportionate naval deterrence response to protect a vessel from what it saw as a legal confiscation, asserting a right to trade without facing military force in international waters.
That's a compelling reading of the buildup, I'll give you that. But I frame Russia's reaction very differently. The deployment of a submarine, a strategic military asset designed for stealth and power projection, to intervene in what is fundamentally a sanctions enforcement matter, that constitutes a clear and deliberate escalation designed to provoke. Russia could have sent surface vessels, a frigate, a destroyer. That would have provided a presence. Instead, they opted for strategic depth.
What do you mean by strategic depth exactly in this context?
The inherent threat that comes with a submerged asset. This choice is less about shielding a rusty ship and more about using this incident to directly challenge the foundation of the U.S. pressure campaign on Venezuela. This all happened around the same time as planned raids targeting President Maduro and meetings with U.S. oil executives. Russia is signaling its willingness to meet economic pressure, not just with diplomacy, but with high-consequence geopolitical muscle. The risk of pairing a military submarine with an enforcement action,
It just drastically raises the stakes.
But if the U.S. is planning a covert capture using special forces, the kind of operation that Fairford buildup implies, a surface ship is, well, it's potentially insufficient. The threat was kinetic and covert, so the response had to be robust.
A robust response doesn't need to raise the specter of an underwater confrontation near NATO maritime choke points.
And that brings us to our first core point of disagreement, how we interpret the U.S. enforcement. Was it legitimate sanctions enforcement, or was it outright economic coercion? I maintain the goal wasn't to stop oil, the ship was empty, it was to confiscate the asset itself, and that's an act of economic warfare. Seizing an empty vessel sends a far more damaging message than just seizing oil. It says, we will seize your property anywhere.
I understand the argument, but the U.S. was tracking a target that was actively evading surveillance. The Bella 1 had already avoided initial blockade attempts. The surveillance assets, the RC-135W, the Typhoon fighters escorting it, those were necessary intelligence-gathering measures for a very complex maritime operation against a target that was not complying.
I'm just not convinced by that, because the sheer scale of the military assets deployed by the US and UK points to something far more aggressive than just passive intelligence gathering. When you position Special Forces transport at RAF Fairford, you are moving toward a hostile boarding capability. If the US is willing to use military force to seize a commercial vessel in international waters, they are by definition inviting a military countermeasure. Russia was simply neutralizing that threat.
But the risk assessment changes entirely with the Russian response. The U.S. was exercising enforcement, an economic policy backed by tracking. Russia chose to meet that with strategic military force. That choice is what initiates the escalation.
Which takes us right to the significance of the submarine, which is really the crux of your argument.
Exactly. Why a submarine? This goes beyond the simple escort. It introduces stealth, high-risk maneuverability, and strategic signaling into what should have been a diplomatic crisis. This deployment wasn't just about protecting the Bella 1 in that moment. It was designed to demonstrate Russia's operational reach deep into the North Atlantic, near the ship's projected route towards Murmansk or Norwegian waters. That is critical maritime space for NATO. It's geopolitical posturing disguised as maritime protection.
They needed to send an unambiguous signal, though. If the U.S. was preparing a clandestine high-speed capture, maybe under cover of darkness, a surface ship could be shadowed or harassed. A submarine, however, operates unseen. It is the most effective, credible deterrent in deep international waters. It signals that any attempt at a covert capture would carry an unacceptable risk of an undersea conflict. It was a credible shield against the highly kinetic U.S. plans.
Necessary, maybe, but disproportionate and highly aggressive. A deterrent does not need to introduce the complexity and risk associated with the strategic asset operating near critical NATO zones. The level of risk here is it's out of proportion to the actual value of a rusty, empty vessel. It suggests the ship itself was less important than the opportunity it gave Russia to push back against U.S. naval superiority in a very sensitive area.
But if the underlying threat is the U.S. asserting a right to military confiscation anywhere in international waters, then the defense has to be equally compelling to deter it from happening again.
Well, let's turn to the diplomatic fallout, because that provides, I think, very clear evidence of Russia's aggressive intent and its success. The Russian response immediately created intense diplomatic friction among NATO allies.
See, I find that the diplomatic tension actually reinforces my argument.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that. The sources refer to a sharp diplomatic dispute in Westminster because UK officials were deeply afraid of Russian retaliation if they helped the US. Russia's move successfully divided Allied opinion right when the US needed support. Russia manufactured that division through military intimidation.
That tension proves the U.S. plan was politically reckless and risked a much broader conflict. If the UK, America's closest naval and intelligence partner, was that hesitant to support the operation because they feared Russian reprisals, it strongly suggests they didn't view the U.S. action as legally sound or politically stable. Their hesitation validates Russia's argument. The fact that the U.S. plan caused this rift shows it was flawed from the very start.
The rift was caused by the threat of Russian military retaliation, not by U.S. surveillance. The UK feared getting caught in the middle. Russia introduced the submarine, And that made the seizure operation far too politically risky for any ally to participate in. That is a highly successful act of strategic aggression. It neutralized the enforcement action not through legal argument, but through calculated military intimidation.
Intimidation or effective deterrence against an illegal act of economic warfare. If the U.S. is going to use special forces to unilaterally seize a commercial vessel, they have to expect a corresponding military capability to be used to deter that. Russia acted to ensure that vessel and the principle of the commercial route it represented remained protected.
And I must insist, this was not purely defensive. Defense protects. This action challenged. It was a calculated, high-profile demonstration of force, designed specifically to undercut the credibility of future U.S. pressure campaigns against Russian interests or its partners.
For me, the incident underscores a fundamental principle. Aggressive, unilateral enforcement of sanctions via naval force will be met with a powerful, if measured, military response designed to deter confiscation and protect trade interests. The U.S. created the initial military crisis.
And for me, this event is less about protecting a rusty tanker and far more about Russia drawing a very sharp line in the sand. They dramatically raised the political and military cost of U.S. pressure campaigns by injecting high-risk strategic military assets directly into a commercial dispute. This move signals a willingness to defend their economic interests globally with the highest level of military means they have.
It appears we'll have to continue to disagree on where the primary catalyst for escalation truly lies.
Indeed. The Bella 1 incident really highlights the razor-thin margin between sanctions enforcement and direct military confrontation in the modern world. And it leaves us weighing whether the primary motivation here was a necessary defense against economic coercion or a calculated escalation intended to undermine U.S. power projection.